This is Lecture 1, The Devastation of Indigenous Peoples. What this lecture is going to do is give you an overview of the general chronology when it came to the colonization of Latin America. It's also going to introduce you to Spanish methods of coercive labor and how these coercive labor systems impacted Native Americans. And you should also understand, after you finish listening to this lecture, the general economic system and how it's changing over time in colonial Latin America. It's going to experience great change if we're looking at this period from the early 1500s and then comparing it to the later stages of colonization in the 17 and 1800s. So if you look at the first slide in this lecture series, you'll see a European painting by the artist Tolin from 1862. And what this shows you is a very Eurocentric, meaning it shows the European perspective of Spanish arrival in the Americas. This painting is actually called The First Landing of Columbus. And I'd like you to take a few minutes to look at this so we can discuss some aspects of the painting and its Eurocentrism. So when you look at this, how does the painting portray the arrival of the Spanish? I would suggest that it's very celebratory. We have Columbus here. He's the one in the red robes, the very central figure of this painting, and he's carrying a flag, claiming his land. He does have his sword withdrawn. You'll notice that it is not actually pointed upward as if he's in battle, but instead is touching the ground. His eyes are heavenward, and you'll also notice, if we think about this particular issue and the religious motivations that the Spanish were emphasizing for conquest, that you've got a priest as part of this initial mission and landing, who's also got a raised cross here in the painting. You'll see other members of Columbus's crew who also are looking heavenward, and actually there are some prostrate people who look like they're kneeling and offering prayers, and the focus of this painting really is on the Europeans. And I would argue that it's trying to emphasize the spiritual motivations for conquest. If you look to even in the background, you'll see that the ship and the horizon are tinged with gold, and to me that's suggestive of the glory of Spain across the ocean. So then the other smaller portion of this painting to your left looks at Native Americans, and how do you think it's portraying them? You probably notice that they're de-emphasized, that they seem to be cowering in the bushes, and we get as a common theme in European portrayals of Native Americans that they're naked and don't really seem to know what's going on. So these European portrayals of colonization, of initial conquest and interaction with Native Americans were actually very prominent, and you'll see this artist didn't make this painting until 1862. So we still see this emphasis on the European mission, religious motivations for conquest. The interest was very lopsided. It was very much focused on what Europeans were doing and what they expected to get out of their relationship with the Americas, and the Native Americans who already lived there are a very marginal piece of the painting and not very well developed. I'd like to give you a general chronology of conquest. So we have Christopher Columbus arriving in the Caribbean, and you'll see that gold and silver were attracting conquistadors and explorers to the Caribbean, but actually it took quite a bit of money to develop sugar plantations and long-term agricultural products that the Caribbean was known for during the period of colonization. So the attention of European conquistadors, particularly Spanish conquistadors, switches from the Caribbean to Mexico and also Peru in the 1550s. By then, the gold supplies in the Caribbean were pretty thin, and the Caribbean became this sleepy backwater of the Spanish Empire until later we're going to have French, English, and Dutch settlers flocking to the area to establish plantation societies. On the left side, we have a picture from Mexico, and on the right side, we have a picture from Peru. Now, the Aztecs and the Incas from Mexico and Peru, respectively, did attract conquistadors and treasure hunters because they were highly urbanized and there was very clear evidence of the mineral wealth in these two areas, gold and silver. So Pizarro went to Peru and led a mission there to overturn the Incan Empire, and Cortez, as you already know, was operating in Mexico and conquering the Aztecs. Now, if you compare these more settled areas with places where people were more nomadic, it actually was a lot easier for conquistadors to go and claim conquest of these more settled areas, the Aztecs and the Incas, in contrast to more nomadic places, because they had a settled urban society. They could use things like their strategy at Tenochtitlan of cutting off the city and slowly starving everyone to death. And it was a lot harder to do that with more mobile populations. So the urban areas, these well-developed centers of empire, attracted them because they were wealthier, they were easier to conquer, unlike more mobile populations which could flee and were harder to claim superiority and conquest of. So if you flip to the next slide, you see an Aztec artist has portrayed the conquest by Spanish invaders. So this would be our Cortez's army against the Aztecs. And you guys now know the general narrative of this conquest. So if you think about this in contrast to the Eurocentric views that were focused on Columbus and the God-given mission to bring Christianity to the Americas, you see the depiction is very different. I can just highlight a few of these things while you look at the slide. One of the things you'll notice is that the Aztec portrayal, this is from the Florentine Codex that you've already read about, is violent. So the first slide you saw from this lecture had Columbus with his sword drawn but pointed downwards. This one, you'll see in contrast, has the Spanish with their swords up. You've got a man who's hung in the background. This is not peaceful interaction between Europeans and the Aztecs. I mean, if you look down at the corner, right, it's really emphasized because you've got dismembered people with blood spurting out. So obviously this one is not the same kind of peaceful portrayal. And as you already know, the Florentine Codex was giving us a more complete picture of European conquest. So here you'll also see some overlap with the primary source that we had talked about earlier. So this one also shows how the Spanish were able to overrun the Aztecs using their Native American allies. So the allies here on the left side are a prominent part of Spanish conquest.